See you here for this last day of Brussels Forum. Every year we think about how to make Sunday morning as exciting and interesting as possible, and I think this year we've really achieved quite an excellent program. As I think all of you know, we're approaching a very important NATO summit. Important both because of the date, 60 years, important because of Afghanistan, as we heard yesterday, important because of French re-engagement. So it's our special pleasure today to open up this morning with the Secretary General of NATO, Jaap Scheffer. Now, I've already warned him I'm not going to do the usual lengthy introduction because he truly is the man that doesn't need an introduction. He did warn me that next year I'll probably have to do a little bit more detail at this point, but maybe not. It is especially significant that he's here today because this will be his last speech before the NATO summit. And we very much hope that this will be the place that he really sets out the agenda, his thinking, as we approach this 60th anniversary summit. Secretary General, the podium's yours.
So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, it must, I think, be a law of nature. The closer we move towards the NATO summit, the more we, and I can tell you, get overwhelmed by organizational nitty-gritty. Do we have the right conference venue? Are the seating arrangements politically correct? I can tell you. Are our security precautions sufficient? After more than 5 years as Secretary General of NATO, I know only too well how this kind of stuff can threaten to occupy our minds. Thankfully, there is always a reliable antidote to such pre-summit tunnel vision, and it is called the German Marshall Fund. The GMF always focuses on the bigger picture, and Craig and Ron and their team have done so once again today. And they've asked me to offer some reflections on NATO's future, and I'm more than happy to oblige, because I consider it crucial that we look beyond the next few weeks, beyond the Strasbourg-Kiel summit, and examine NATO's longer-term development. And let me add, it is also necessary that we do so in an honest, open, but also self-critical manner. Why should I emphasize this? I emphasize it because I believe NATO has arrived at a crucial juncture. On the one hand, the relevance of the alliance is more widely accepted than ever before. Just remember in this regard NATO's 50th anniversary in 1999. That summit took place against the backdrop of a controversial air operation in the Balkans. I say controversial, but nevertheless necessary. At its 40th anniversary in 1989, it even looked as if NATO could break apart over differences of how to respond to the Gorbachev challenge. By contrast, today no one seriously argues that NATO's days are numbered. 2 new members are on the verge of joining NATO, and France is about to take its full place again in our integrated military structure. And that's all very good news, you'll say, and I say, but it is not the whole story. Because NATO's growing appeal also raises its very own challenges. NATO is expected to help set Afghanistan on the right course. It is expected to reconcile the continuing desire of several nations to join the alliance with the need for a solid NATO-Russia relationship. And it is expected to find a convincing answer to new and unconventional threats. This makes for a pretty full plate. And predictably, some observers have warned of a growing mismatch between mounting political and military commitments on the one hand and dwindling resources and political will on the other. So, what are we to make of all this? Should we simply accept that NATO's future is being a jack of all trades and master of none, and thereby take the risk of strategic failure? Or should we pull the emergency brake and limit our agenda to a few essential tasks at the risk of ignoring the tremendous potential we could bring to the real world? Clearly, the time has come to take a hard look at NATO's future evolution. And I would like to do so first by identifying the key drivers of this evolution and then sketching out what we must do in order to steer this evolution in the right direction. In my view, the future of NATO will be determined by three key factors. First, of course, the evolution of the global security environment. In other words, what are the challenges that we need to confront in the years ahead, and how do they affect us? The second factor is the sense of common purpose among the Allies. In other words, do we share a common perception of the threats and of the responses, and if so, can we muster the political will to act? The third factor relates to NATO as an institution. Can the organization generate sufficient political influence and military means in order to perform what we expect of it, from it? Let me briefly address these three factors. The first is, as I said, the evolution of our security environment. This evolution, of course, does not proceed entirely independently from NATO. Indeed, if we use the alliance wisely, we can shape our environment to a considerable degree, as we have been able to do in post-Cold War Europe. But I think it's fair to say that in an age marked by globalization, our ability to shape our environment will diminish. Just compare our Afghanistan mission to our Balkan engagement. Bringing peace to the Balkans was not just easier in military terms. There, we could also offer attractive political and economic incentives, such as NATO and European Union membership. In other words, there in the Balkans, we could offer a compelling package to bring Southeast Europe back into the European mainstream. In Afghanistan, in that region, and without any doubt in other future contingencies, we have far less clout. And that is not all. Many challenges will not lend themselves to purely military solutions. Some challenges will be regional in nature, as we see in Afghanistan, and may not affect all allies in quite the same way. And while some of those challenges may require instant, perhaps sometimes even preventive action, others will require long-term, costly and risky engagement far away from our own borders. In a nutshell, our future security environment can divide us just as easily as it can unite us. In the Cold War, the threat we faced was both visible and measurable, and our responses were largely institutionalized. But this can no longer be the model that guides our thinking or planning. In the past, solidarity was almost automatic. Now today, when we go beyond the NATO's core business of collective defense, important as it is, solidarity needs to be generated case by case and then carefully sustained. So what do we do about this? And this, in essence, brings me to a second factor that will shape the future of NATO. The degree to which we can shape common purpose among the allies for the challenges we face in the 21st century. We need to come to a new understanding about the meaning of shared security. It's not enough to invoke imagery of a community of values, and it's certainly not enough to point to NATO's past achievements. Images of NATO as a knight in shining armor will only distract us from the serious task of shaping consensus on what we should do together today and how. Now, as you know, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for decades, NATO has been described as a transatlantic bargain. This was, and I think is still, an apt description. NATO enlists North America, the United States and Canada for the defense of Europe. It gives those North American democracies a say in the evolution of European security. It provides the United States of America with like-minded partners to face global challenges, and it gives Europe a voice in Washington. It gives a united Europe a voice in Washington. The word united is not in my text, but it should, of course, be in my text. We all know that this bargain, this transatlantic bargain, was never uncontested. In the Cold War, as many of us will remember, Americans would sometimes complain that the bargain worked to their disadvantage, as they were effectively subsidizing European defense. And Europeans would occasionally complain that the bargain was unfair to them, since it did not provide them with sufficient influence over US policies. Yet, this transatlantic bargain worked. It worked because everyone knew that transatlantic cohesion was essential to cope with the challenges at hand. It worked because everyone understood the logic of give and take. In short, it worked because each nation could easily see the advantages that the bargain offered for its own security. Now, this notion, ladies and gentlemen, of a transatlantic bargain, I think, remains eminently sound. However, in a far more complex security environment. That bargain needs to be extended to cover a wider range of concerns and interests, from territorial defense through regional stability, all the way to cyber defense, energy security, and the consequences of climate change. Now, adapting the transatlantic bargain, as Ron Asmus recently reminded us, also means something else. It means balancing our policy of engagement with Russia with strategic reassurance for our allies that their security needs are being met. That's an important notion. And frankly, we have a broad range of views in NATO when it comes to Russia, from the very cautious to the very forward-leaning. However, one thing is certainly true. The more reassurance NATO provides for its members, the more confident they will be to engage with Russia on a wide range of issues. The more the perception of threat is gone, the more the possibilities for a true partnership will open up. Now, it goes without saying, ladies and gentlemen, that Afghanistan has been the forcing mechanism for us to broaden our concept of what a common approach to security means today. Some might call it a trial by fire. Now, let me be clear. It would be naive to believe that 26 and soon 28 different countries with different strategic cultures, different constitutions and parliaments would engage in Afghanistan in perfect lockstep. And I think it would even be counterproductive to make that happen. We must allow for a certain degree of flexibility, or else NATO would become a straitjacket and lose the support of its members. Yet, flexibility must not come at the expense of coherence and effectiveness. We must not create the impression that Afghanistan can be neatly divided into regional compartments. Afghanistan, and I can add the region, is won or lost as a whole. Nor should we cling to the illusion that peacekeeping and combat can be neatly separated, or that they represent different moral categories. One of the most important notions I take away from 5 years being Secretary General of NATO and 5 years Afghanistan. Peacekeeping and combat cannot be neatly separated, and they do not represent different moral categories. Why am I saying this? Because I think realities on the ground are telling a different story. A transatlantic bargain for an alliance that is engaged in operations must be based on these operational realities. It must be based on a clear appreciation that nations may choose different approaches. Any NATO ally thinks its approach to development, cooperation and reconstruction is by far the best. By far. So let them choose different approaches, but let them all work towards the same end. And that is especially pertinent now, as we speak, as we approach what has been called the Big Tent meeting in The Hague on the 31st of this month, and then, of course, the NATO summit. There will be a lot of talk of strategy with regard to Afghanistan, including, of course, the so necessary regional approach, more forces in the south of the country, stepped up civilian efforts and a greater coordination between all the elements of the effort, civilian and military. I support all those ideas. They make sense. But we will have to ensure that we deliver on what we agree, which means coordinated action and more resources. From time to time, and I see many of my colleagues in the room today, I tell the ambassadors assembled around the table in the North Atlantic Council, we, as we sit around this table, are not the editorial board of The Economist. We are the ambassadors of the North Atlantic Alliance, which is not a talking shop, but which should take action. And in Afghanistan, also in the short term, we need action. We need deliverables, as is the key word as we approach the summit in Strasbourg and Kiel. So analysis is fine. Action at the moment is much more important. So I hope that my words will reverberate along the NATO, across the NATO table in the coming week. Will they not, dear colleague ambassadors? Which brings me to the third and last factor that will shape NATO's future, its performance as an organization. Safeguarding our security requires more than a common assessment of the challenges and the political will to act together. It also requires an institutional tool to translate a shared vision into common action. And here too, NATO cannot afford to stand still. The new security environment requires the organization to evolve. In business terms, NATO must provide a faster and more comprehensive service for the customers than ever before. Much has already been achieved. The number of committees has been cut, the command structure is being streamlined, and partner countries are associated with our work in ways that were unthinkable just a few years ago. We've set up an Allied Command transformation to create a focal point for new concepts. And we have reached out to other international organizations and non-governmental organizations. But also here, we must do even more. We need to take a hard look, a very hard look indeed, at the way we plan and generate forces, at the manner in which we fund our operations, and at the promise of acquiring more commonly owned assets. We also need to look at ways to streamline our decision-making, in upholding the principle of consensus, of course, to better integrate the different strands of NATO's work and to use our resources more efficiently. But we also need to further expand NATO's role as a forum for political debate. Given the growing diversity of the challenges before us, our responses, as I said, will not be automatic. They will have to be generated through informed debate, and this means that we must be willing to discuss critical subjects such as nuclear proliferation, energy security, or the security implications of climate change, early and openly. And even if current operations, of course, will continue to occupy most of our time, it is no longer appropriate to look at NATO merely as an instrument for force generation. This organization must give us more, and I think it can give us more. Now, coming to grips with a new diverse security environment, generating a new transatlantic bargain, and adapting NATO to be better able to implement that bargain, all this, of course, constitutes a truly Herculean task. It is not something that you achieve in a few weeks, let alone in a 1.5-day summit. Still, our meeting in Strasbourg and Kiel and Baden-Baden can be a big step in the right direction. The political constellation is favorable. There is a new United States administration that is determined to take a fresh approach. There is, I see, a European willingness to respond positively to this new approach. The return of France in NATO's integrated military structure will strengthen the alliance and, as important, help reduce the ambivalence in the NATO-European Union relationship. And a temporary freeze in the NATO-Russia relationship is thawing. Now we must translate all this into political momentum, and we will, or at least we'll give it a try. The summit will endorse a short but powerful so-called Declaration on Alliance Security. And this document will reiterate NATO's fundamentals as a strong transatlantic community where security is indivisible. But even more importantly, I expect the summit to give the green light to start work on a new strategic concept. This process will engage all allies in a major intellectual exercise about all aspects of NATO, and in particular, the meaning of solidarity in our new security environment. And if we do it right, this can be a catalyst not only for NATO's own evolution, but also for the broader network of institutions that we so urgently need. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as I said in the beginning, NATO is at a critical juncture. We have never been in greater demand, yet we have never been confronted with bigger challenges. And this explains why we cannot and do not consider our 60th anniversary summit next month as only a commemorative event. On the contrary, that summit is very much about the future of this alliance. And if one considers the tremendous journey that NATO has traveled since its creation, one cannot be but optimistic about its future. From a mere piece of paper, the alliance has turned into one of the world's premier international organizations. From just 12 member states, we went to 26 and soon 28. And from a purely Eurocentric alliance, NATO has evolved into a security provider that is engaged on several continents, working with a wide range of other nations and institutions. A pretty impressive track record, I think. A strong testimony as well of our collective ability to meet any kind of challenge. And above all, a very good reason to look to NATO's future with a lot of confidence. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you. That was great. Have a seat. Thank you so much. We have to restructure the stage for just a second. Since this is the last day, I want to thank again all of the people that have made this possible. The government of Belgium, the Daimler company, the Czech Republic, and German Marshall Fund, I guess, as well as the Ministry of Defense of the Republic of Latvia, Bertelsmann Stiftung, Fortis Bank, and the Tipping Point Foundation. We're very, very grateful for their support in putting on this event. We're especially lucky today to have, as one of the, I guess, the penultimate panel of this conference, a really extraordinary group of people to talk about the future of NATO. And I think just about all of them have been involved in other GMF events. Congresswoman Ellen Tauscher, who spoke at our conference in Bucharest before the Bucharest NATO summit, Radosław Sikorski, the foreign minister of Poland, who has been involved in Brussels forums since the very first one, when he was Minister of Defense at the time. Peter MacKay, who's also been involved in every one of the Brussels forum, first as the Foreign Minister of Canada and now as the Minister of Defense. And obviously the Secretary General will join as well. And as part of our, I think, good relationship that we've developed with the BBC, we also have Jonathan Marcus to do the moderation. So Jonathan, why don't you bring your panel out and we'll get ready to go. Thank you.
MacKay. Good morning. Good to see so many of you here, despite the relentless pace and the late night sessions. So the good news is that there are no night owl sessions this evening. You can actually get some sleep. Well, the introductions have been done for me. I have to point out one or two small additions to the biographies, because the GMF, in its unnerving ability to get just the right panel for just the right subject, Ellen Tauscher, Congresswoman Tauscher, is kind of double-hatted here. Not only is she a congresswoman and chair of the subcommittee on strategic weapons, I think? Forces in Congress, but also it's, I think, expected that she's going to become Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. It's certainly been leaked to the media. Anyway, I'd remind you that's John Bolton's old job, a name that strikes fear into the hearts of Europeans everywhere, but what can you do? Obviously, Peter MacKay, Defence Minister of his country. Interestingly, in the biography we have here, it says that he's also describes him, I don't know if it's a misprint, as a critic for the Prime Minister, in which case the Canadian Prime Minister is a very lucky man. He only has one critic. I think Gordon Brown would be interested in adopting maybe the same system. We heard yesterday about Sikorski's amazingly prescient unarmed reconnaissance in Afghanistan 30 years before the alliance was going to become engaged there. But nonetheless, what's interesting is that, again, the German Marshall Fund, we have two of the more dynamic, younger ministerial leaders of the alliance, both of whose names obviously have been in the frame to succeed the Secretary General, both of whom represent countries in the southern group, if you like, in Afghanistan, whose forces are very heavily engaged there. You set an agenda, Secretary General, very, very clearly, so let's begin with the forthcoming summit itself. There was a lot of talk here about honeymoons, a honeymoon for the Obama administration, a honeymoon maybe in relations between NATO and the United States. Well, in Strasbourg, Kiel, it's clearly going to be an opportunity for a reaffirmation of the marriage vows. As somebody once said, there are more than two of us in this marriage. There's quite a lot of people in this NATO marriage. But if I could ask you, Minister, first of all, I mean, this isn't just a ceremonial occasion, obviously. Is it an opportunity to push the reset button on NATO?
The short answer is yes. And just before I respond, I want to thank the German Marshall Fund again for the invitation to come to be on this venerable panel and participate in what is an extremely open, inclusive forum, which is symbolic, I think, of NATO itself. I think that NATO and Jaap has set the agenda like a buffet. There are a lot of great ideas that have been introduced, not only in his opening remarks, but certainly in the work that he has done, his 5 years as Secretary General, a very aggressive and forward-leaning approach, and certainly the run-up to this summit allows us to not only press the reset, but I think re-examine where we are today and how we're going to get there in a very strategic approach, which is, of course, a comfortable place for NATO to be, given the military alliance that it is. And we can never forget, NATO is a military alliance. As Jaap said, it's not the multilateral, multinational talk shop. It has action in its core. It has military capabilities. So it is capabilities, it is operational, and it is partnerships that we look at. On the operational side, obviously, there have been challenges. The issue of burden sharing has been front and center throughout the mission in Afghanistan. I think what countries need to do, and what, as a Canadian, as a representative of a country that, as you said, is in the South, is in the fray, what we ask of all participants in NATO and non-NATO, and I'm quick to point out that there are countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, who are also making significant contributions, and others. But countries have to look at what their capacity is and what their contributions are, and marry them up. If they can't send troops, if it's not boots on the ground, is it financial? Is it the ability to do more on the humanitarian side? This whole joined-up approach requires a lot of coordination, getting everybody focused and pulling in that proper direction that will ensure success. People have said Afghanistan is the litmus test, the crucible for the alliance, and I agree. Failure is simply not an option. There's too much at stake. I heard Bob Zellick yesterday talk about the financial crisis, of course, and how this is affecting people, how it's affecting their livelihoods, their life savings. Afghanistan is affecting human life. And not only the people in Afghanistan, we know that the ability of Afghanistan to project outwards as the incubator of terrorism that it was prior to 2001 and at other times in its past, we have to get it right. On the partnership side, I think what NATO has to do is continue to look out to other countries as future participants, either inside or in partnership with NATO. How we get along with the European Union, extremely important. As a Canadian, I have a different perspective of that, but I see that NATO's ability to manage the relationship with the European Union and the United Nations, and dare I say, again, those countries outside of NATO, that's an extremely important function of NATO. So there's a great deal and an ambitious agenda coming out of the summit. Canada has a very strong vested interest as a 60-year founding nation within NATO. We follow events extremely closely. We participate actively. Pre-NATO, both wars, Korea, and missions leading up to Afghanistan. I'll finish on this note. I had the opportunity yesterday to do something that many Canadians consider a pilgrimage, and that was to go to Vimy Ridge. Some have described that as the founding of our country. I was reminded, again, of the human cost of conflict. Canada has 100,000 of its citizens buried on this continent. I called 4 parents and spouses yesterday as a result of recent casualties in Afghanistan. There is so much at stake. We can't fail in Afghanistan. We can't fail in this important alliance, and the world's depending on us.
Tauscher, what are the Americans hoping for from their European partners at this summit?
Well, I like the analogy of honeymoon. I'm getting married myself at the end of June.
Congratulations.
So I'm hoping for thank you, a very long honeymoon and a very rich relationship. But of course, honeymoons always start with the basics, and it means having good partners. And I think from our point of view in the United States, I think in North America, we know we have a great partner in our Canadian friends who always step up. I think at home, some of my other colleagues, I think I've spoken eloquently over the last couple of days. When I was on Wall Street, we had a thing called deal fatigue. Now I think we've got lots of deals and lots of fatigue. Certainly, we need a narrative at home for exactly what is going on in Afghanistan and why it's important. I think we not only need it for the American people, but I think we need it for our partners in NATO and in the writ large, the folks that are supporting our efforts there. For, I think, many of us, there was a success in conflating Iraq and Afghanistan, which was probably one of the bigger mistakes that was made. And now we've got to step back and make clear what is different about Afghanistan, why Afghanistan is so important, why that geographic space that has had such an unfortunate history, such high illiteracy, not a lot to really commend itself other than hardworking good people that deserve a chance. Why that space needs to be occupied until those people can do it responsibly. We know clearly what happened when that space was not occupied, when that country could not govern itself. And we cannot allow that to happen again, not only because of what happened to us in the United States, but for what it means for others that could also be laid prey to by those very bad people. So I think what we want here in the United States is a sense of common narrative, that we actually understand what is important about Afghanistan, what is at risk. As someone who is a very big fan of NATO and a supporter of NATO, I need to be able to tell my 657,000 constituents what's happening. why this has been a hard slog, why this has been a struggle. What is it that we're now going to do that's going to be differently? I believe that our commitment to add 17,000 troops and others is the beginning of a new clarity and a new commitment. But once again, we need to have a sense at home that, that we're not disproportionately going to be at risk, that we're not going to, after overextending our military in Iraq for so long, now that things are doing better and we're going to be rotating out, that the stop-loss policy that has been so burdensome on families and for our military is now going to be harder to get back into the right size because of Afghanistan. So there's a lot of this, I think, frankly, that's about the narrative. What is the story? What are the opportunities? Clearly, part of it is to setting expectations. But let me be clear, that is not dumbing down expectations. That is not, I think my friend Senator McCain is very wise in talking about, as we clarify and redefine what the mission in Afghanistan is, that we do not make it minimal, that we do not say that this is really about going and then getting out. In the end, this is going to take a lot longer than I think we expect. It's going to be losses in the short term more than we want, but I think that it is clear that this is something that we have to do together. And as Jaap has said, this is a defining moment for NATO, and we have got to get this right.
Radosław Sikorski, another summit, another lengthy document, at least it will be in preparation, it will emerge in due course. Why is this new strategic concept for NATO so crucially important?
Because the old one is 10 years old and you need to update it. Jaap has already mentioned the Declaration on Alliance Security. It's a good document. We hope it will be the basis for the new concept. But I'd like to point out that the situation has changed too. 10 years ago, when we were joining, everybody assumed that we would be consumers of security. Well, today we don't have any American or alliance troops on our territory, but there are Polish troops in Afghanistan. And indeed, we've taken part in every NATO operation since then. So we are a contributor, and we want this to be recognized. And I think what the Secretary General mentioned is very important, that our part of the NATO territory still needs some reassurance, some strategic reassurance, because we will be able to contribute to operations the more we feel that home territory is safe. And then I think what the summit should do is give an even greater sense of urgency that Jaap conveyed to us, namely that this is not an ordinary time, that it's not business as usual for NATO. We have to decide whether we are serious about winning in Afghanistan and whether we need wartime leadership. And that means perhaps overriding some of the procedures that we have inherited from the past from a different time. We have procedures for generating forces, for example, that were set up at a time when NATO was assumed to be preparing for a total war. And when there is total war, people don't spare forces. But for a more limited engagement, I think we need rules for sharing the burden fairly. On the troops side and on the cost side, and we don't.
Now, those who actually send the troops actually foot the whole bill.
Indeed, and we also need procedures for sending those troops to the theatre, for them to be used according to military logic and not according to political logic. And it's very difficult to do, but unless we do it, we won't reverse the trends in Afghanistan, which are not favorable right now.
Secretary General, the alliance needs to be put almost on a war footing. Ellen Tauscher talked about getting a narrative of the events in Afghanistan, the importance of Afghanistan, over to alliance populations. That's something that certainly many countries' governments have failed. Why is that? Why have they not been better able to make the case? And is that something that perhaps NATO as an organisation might be able to devote funds towards? Better public information, better engagements with the alliance publics?
certainly better public information. NATO, of course, as I tried to indicate in my introduction, NATO's most important operational priority is Afghanistan. NATO is, of course, more than about Afghanistan, but Afghanistan brings a number of the crucial issues together in this regard. By the way, when you interrupted Radek, I do not think that we should go to a system where every nation only funds its own forces. I think that we should go to a system financing our operations where there's a bigger solidarity than we have now. We have a lack of financial burden sharing. I add political burden sharing is also very important, military burden sharing, but we certainly have a lack of financial burden sharing. But I think the narrative Alan Tauscher quite rightly is speaking about is the narrative of, first of all, to be serious. How can we be serious about the integrity of the NATO territory, which is the Washington Treaty, which is Article 5? But how can we at the same time be serious that we can help to get Afghanistan and the region right? And I spoke about not being in different moral categories in the reconstruction and development and in the war fighting, because let us not forget, and that is perhaps for public opinion a bit of a more difficult story to tell, let us not forget that in that area we are fighting on the front line in a fight against terrorism. Now that is more difficult to understand perhaps for a European audience than for a United States audience, because I still see a perception gap between the United States of America, Canada, Peter is a better judge, and Europe. And I'll explain. 9/11 was a terrorist attack to the very heart of the United States of America. And every US citizen perceived it like that. In Europe, when a terrorist attack happens, where we saw the horror in Madrid or in London or elsewhere, it is of course deplored and it is considered dramatic, but it is, because Europe is not yet finished, it is not considered to be an attack against the heart of Europe. It is an attack in a specific European country. In other words, and then you come to the public perception and to public diplomacy, I do think that the notion of terrorism is still differently perceived in the United States of America than it is in Europe. And that has nothing to do, before I misunderstood, that has nothing to do with what kind of administration there is in the US. That is a perception and a mentality question. Very, very relevant for NATO if we are in Afghanistan, because everybody likes reconstruction and development, but much less people like to be on the front line in the fight against terrorism. And that is why Peter says failure is not an option in Afghanistan, because failure there will also affect heavily the credibility of NATO, but it will simply bring those guys not only to Afghanistan, but to us, in Warsaw, in Ottawa, in Austin, Texas, excuse me, in California, or wherever we like. So that is a major challenge for NATO. And if I may finally go one step further, that does mean, and that's why this big tent meeting in The Hague is important, if we want to get that region right, we need Russia. We need Russia for many more different and complicated and complex questions. We need, and that's the interesting thing of the 31st of March, you need Iran as well as a neighbor of Afghanistan and as a player in the region. Now if you can combine, and that's why I think the idea for the big tent is, on second thoughts, on first thoughts I was not that keen, but I'm keen now, is an interesting idea, because at the same time the US hopefully gets the opportunity to bring Iran into the equation on other dossiers than Afghanistan, and for us it is important because we have not only the region but also other major players together. And if I say other major players, NATO is not only about Afghanistan, NATO is also very much about our relationship with Russia, which brings again into the equation Radek's comments on NATO's core function plus NATO's operational expeditionary capabilities in Afghanistan and elsewhere.
Let's look at what NATO does. I mean, in your speech you mentioned energy security, global warming. NATO's become involved in partnerships of every kind. I'm not seeking to diminish these activities, but there does seem to be a growing groundswell in the alliance that it should somehow get back to basics, get back to the core principles. Radek Sikorski, you've said that the alliance needs to make the traditional security guarantees credible again. Why are they not?
I believe that they are, but in my part of the world we have a historic experience of guarantees that they need to be backed by capabilities, even by logistics. And if you look at events of last August, for example, in the Caucasus, Georgia is, of course, not a member of our alliance yet, but it was widely assumed that she was a special partner of the United States. And when push came to shove, logistics decided as usual, and we were not able to help Georgia much.
Peter MacKay, you're a back-to-basics man.
Well, I am a back-to-basics man, and I think, the Secretary General mentioned Article 5. Article 5 is, of course, the collective security. It is the principle of solidarity. If one country is attacked, we're all in, which sends a chill were Georgia in as to what could have occurred. Some would argue the attack perhaps wouldn't have happened because there's a deterrent element in NATO. And I think what Radek has said very eloquently is there is a feeling that countries have territorial defense and expeditionary capabilities. And some are worried about the ability to do both. It's a false dichotomy. NATO has to do both. There is the principle that we have to be able to ensure our own territorial sovereignty and stability, but also be able to come to the aid of others, as we're doing in Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, just to revisit the core principle there, it's to stabilize, secure, enable, and leave. What we want to do, obviously, is ensure the capacity of the Afghan security forces to secure their own borders once they're determined where they are, and to get on with what may be the next mission. We're seeing countries, again, and I credit both Poland, and I think another good example that is on the cusp of NATO membership is Croatia. Countries that were recipients of territorial expeditions and are now significant contributors. And that, to me, again, is a hallmark of success about the alliance. The ability to embrace those countries and to make them part of the NATO family, the alliance that has this global responsibility. NATO's gone global. That's one of the great accomplishments in our 60 years. The ability to reach out, to identify niche capabilities, which again I think is an important part of the re-examination or restart. If you don't have the same military capability, obviously, and with the greatest respect of the United States, there are many other roles for NATO countries. And that's not to say that it is a buffet. We all have important responsibilities, and combat being perhaps the greatest need right now. But to get it right, this comprehensive, joined-up, common approach that we are seeing now take hold in Afghanistan will work. Because it's a very basic concept, in my view, of team. Radek can be a great striker. Ellen can be a defender. Jaap's the goalie. Each country has an ability to play an important role on the field. But again, you have to ask yourself and ask for the most from the team, the management, the players, and the participants to do their best and to finish the job.
Tauscher, you've never been out of the expeditionary business. You went global much earlier than NATO did, perhaps. You reassured by the sorts of things you're hearing here?
I am. But I think, let me just take a little different tack than back to basics, because I think you can only go back to basics if you assume that nothing has changed, and I think everything has changed. Certainly the asymmetry that we find to be so threatening, the non-state actors. I hope, and I'm speaking as a congresswoman, not as somebody that potentially could do something else in the future, I think non-proliferation has to be a big part of NATO's future agenda. I think that we can be as expeditionary and ready as we want to be. We can figure out how to have force structures and share capabilities and who's got the C-17s and who does bio, and we can do all that and split the portfolio and absolutely be agreeable and congruent all day long. If we don't get this non-proliferation issue right, if we don't understand how to strengthen international regimes, and if we don't understand what the asymmetry threat is, I also believe that we need to have a layered network, short and medium range missile defense system in Europe. I think that whatever the United States does in the future to expand our long-range capabilities, I see sitting in Washington and in California a tremendous threat, especially to Southern Europe right now, and I see no capabilities. That is something that in the United States we have to say to ourselves, I feel a little naked to being called upon to do something, and I think NATO, in not only in planning, but in absolutely in putting out their capabilities and investments, has got to begin to talk about this kind of thing. Russia, obviously our relationship with Russia is evolving. It's like one of those complicated long-term relationships. On a 10-story building with Russia, on the first floor we're smiling and having coffee, on the second floor we're slapping each other silly, and on the third floor we're handing each other checks, and on the fourth floor we're demarching ourselves. It's a very complicated relationship. We need to start renegotiated. Obviously, we want to have a strong relationship ongoing with Russia, but clearly what happened in Georgia is still a problem. So I think that the challenge for us is to understand what has changed and to be able to move more quickly in planning and in execution, to be much more 21st century in how we have our systems and operations, and certainly in how we make our decisions. But at the same time, I think the values that created NATO 60 years ago are even more important now, and are fundamentally where our peoples want us to go. I also believe that we need to get our peoples and our parliaments understanding exactly what a great deal NATO is and why it is. And that is part of the conversation, I believe, and the narrative that we have to develop.
Secretary General, does the alliance have the resources to be able to deal with all of these new issues, but also adequately to address the core functions that everybody is stressing need more attention?
Not if the intention would be that NATO would be the jack of all trades. Yes, if we could define Peter's buffet approach more thoroughly than we have done up to now, what is NATO's added value? NATO is not in the climate change business. That's not why I mentioned climate change or global warming. But if you look at the high north in Europe, there could very well be security consequences of the thawing of the polar ice cap, a northwest passage, energy. NATO is not in the energy security business, but, by the way, in the present strategic concept of 99, there is already a notion of the free flow of energy. What needed a tank division 50 years ago is now an energy lever to be closed. And we saw those pictures on television, didn't we? We saw a man closing those levers, or levers, as others would say. You needed a tank division to paralyze a country. What do you know now? You organize a cyber attack. Let me mention Estonia and how that can terrorize a nation. In other words, that all has security implications, and NATO has to define its added value. If NATO would think it would be the jack of all trades, it would go totally wrong. It would forget about its core responsibilities. But we should realize, and that's why I say with Alan and with Peter, the security environment had changed in the sense that in 2005, after the earthquake in Pakistan, could NATO have said no when the Pakistani came to us and said, you are the only organization in the world which can bring in heavy engineering equipment, which can bring in hospitals. Be careful, because it's Kashmir, by the way, and it's a political minefield, literally, and in another sense as well. In other words, saying no and say ring the neighbor's doorbell if these issues come up is awfully difficult, and I think impossible. The discussion we had about Pakistan is, what are we going to send? Are we going to send the NATO response force? Who is going to pay for that NATO response force? So we have a number of very hot issues to decide upon, financially and politically. We do have a NATO response force, but we have a very difficult debate what the NATO response force is for. And as long as we do not seriously take a decision, not discuss it, not the editorial board of The Economist, but if we do not take a decision what is the NRF and when and under what circumstances we are going to use it, I can guarantee that in 5 years, when my successor finishes his term or her term, there will not be a NATO response force anymore. In other words, let the discussion and the notion about a new strategic concept be an argument for this alliance to act, to discuss first and to organize seminars or have a group of wise men. I mean, that is up to the heads of state and government to decide. But let us address a number of very fundamental issues, because otherwise the answer to your question will be no. And I say with Peter, the same forces we do need for the core function, for the Article 5 function, expeditionary are the forces we need for Afghanistan and elsewhere. Because if it would ever come, heaven forbid, to the defense of alliance territory, we also need expeditionary forces. Those forces cannot stay where they are. They have to be transported. We need the C-17 transport aircraft. We need to be much more inventive about what we buy collectively, not only C-17s, but helicopters, hospitals, logistics. I mean, then we can have a less uneven burden sharing in the financial sense and as a consequence in the political sense, because those two elements, unequal burden sharing politically, unequal burden sharing financially, are two of the major challenges I do see for the coming period.
Jonathan, can I make one small point, just a corollary to the lexicon of threats that are out there, and this issue of the North, for example, as a country that has 3 oceans, the Arctic Ocean. We actually neighbor with Russia. Sometimes we forget that, except when their planes visit us. And we also recognize that piracy on the high seas, piracy on the high seas, and terrorism on our marine approaches has now as well become a very serious issue. And we're seeing that at the Horn of Africa. We're seeing, again, the necessity of equipment. Yes, C-17s, helicopters, tanks, ships, and our ability to get there and protect the World Food Aid Program, for example, being able to provide that important humanitarian relief. This has also become part of a NATO responsibility in close conjunction with the United Nations. So, yes,
and the EU.
And the EU, of course. Again, it speaks to Ellen's point of how we need to modernize the organization to match the changing, evolving threat security environment that we're in, and the very real challenges that NATO will have going forward.
Thank you. Let's go to some questions now. I like the analogy of the apartment building. Let's hope you're not chucking each other off the roof when you get to the top floor. But let's have some questions. Sir, there, if we can get a microphone. Okay. And what I think we might do is spend quite a lot of the remaining time on questions, because...
A question to the Secretary General. Sir, 5 years ago you addressed a GMF event on the sidelines of the Istanbul summit about the Black Sea. And after that, after your speech there, it was still necessary to ask you in the Q&A period, what is actually NATO policy in the Black Sea region? I think it is a case for repeating that question now, 5 years later. What is NATO policy in the Black Sea region on the issues of enlargement, on the issue of Russia's compliance with the CFE Treaty and the Istanbul commitments? Somebody was saying yesterday in the Georgia panel that Russia should fulfill some of the Istanbul commitments. What is NATO policy on the issues of peacekeeping and on resolving the frozen conflicts? And finally, as an overarching question, do you feel that placing Afghanistan at the absolute top of the list of priorities, and as NATO and the United States are seemingly plunging headlong into Pakistan after Afghanistan, will that result in downgrading the NATO's eastern neighborhood on NATO's list of priorities? Is the eastern neighborhood a bridge none too far?
Let's take 2 questions at a time. You could pass the microphone to the lady behind you.
Thank you. My name is Gita Beck. I'm the chairperson of the Danish Foreign Policy Committee. I have a question about the future of NATO, because instead of looking what we're doing now, and we could discuss burden sharing in Afghanistan for the next 3 hours, I would like to ask you, where do you see NATO in 10 years or 20 years' time? Because I have to think, I think we have to look into the future, and we have to also to consider what will happen if Russia asks to be member of NATO 20 years' time, 30 years' time, It might not be possible, but at least we discussed it yesterday. So if you could give me or us the perspectives of NATO, I would be very pleased. Thank you.
Okay. Secretary General, perhaps first off.
Well, on that last question, I've done my best, I think, preceding this panel discussion. By the way, picking up one point, I do see that it should be possible. If you go for a time frame of 15, 20 years, I hope at least that you would see further rapprochement between Russia and NATO and change the political environment in that regard. I have never heard any ambition from Moscow, so this is still a rather virtual scenario, that they would be thinking in the same direction. But I did my best on NATO in the future, so I'll ask my colleagues to comment on that. The other question, or questions rather, were manifold. Let me pick two. I do not think that the fact that Afghanistan is our number one operational priority, and I think with 60,000 forces now under NATO command in Afghanistan, one can hardly, and the stakes I've tried to identify that high in that part of the world, Afghanistan and the region, one could hardly blame anyone, the Secretary General or any other NATO official, for making Afghanistan into the most important operational priority. But does that mean that we forget about the Eastern Dimension? Of course not. Of course not. Look at the NATO-Georgia Commission, look at the NATO-Ukraine Commission, look at the decision taken in Bucharest last week, a decision which stands. Look at the way everyone, including me, is underlining the open door principle of NATO. On the other hand, I say with the French President Sarkozy, becoming a member of the democratic family of nations called NATO is not a right in its own right, I should almost say. It has to be earned. Nations have to perform. And then the Allies will at a certain stage take a political decision. The Allies will take a political decision. Not any outside nation will take that decision or will influence that decision. The Allies will do it. I think we are paying a lot of attention to the Eastern dimension. And as far as the Black Sea is concerned, we must realize, I mentioned the High North, and Peter mentioned the High North. Of course, the NATO policy in the Black Sea, let's say spearheaded by the relevant NATO allies in that area, is a policy of security, is a policy of stability. And I agree with you if you say that has to do, of course, with the Caucasus, very much so. It has to do with other developments. It's an important region for NATO, as is the High North. Let us, on the other hand, keep NATO as a whole. We should not see that we have a sort of 4 or 5 NATOs, where the High North and the Black Sea and the Mediterranean and other regional elements are important. There is one NATO, and let's not regionalize NATO. That is the warning I would like to flag. But it goes without saying that the Black Sea region, given all those political factors and circumstances, is a very important region for NATO.
Should we perhaps go to another question? The lady down here in the corner.
Hi, I'm Amanda Sloat from the U.S. Congress. I wanted to follow up on some of the previous comments made about missile defense. Several weeks ago, President Obama sent a letter to Russian President Medvedev making the comment that perhaps if we could find ways to dissuade Iran from pursuing nuclear proliferation, then the missile defense system in Poland and the Czech Republic might be less necessary. My question is the panel's thoughts on the wisdom of that decision, both as a means of improving cooperation with Russia and also the political implications of that in Poland, and particularly in the Czech Republic that expended some political capital on that. Second question is what that means for the future of NATO's own plans for missile defense.
Okay, while you're thinking about missile defense, let me just pass the microphone to this gentleman here, and then we can answer both of them.
Thank you. I'd like to take up Peter MacKay's remarks about resources and capabilities. Now, there's a hell of a burden to share out there, but we won't be able to share it if we don't have the capabilities to meet it. So how can we, and I have to say I think the Canadian Armed Forces have done an outstanding job of transformation, but how can we persuade European allies in particular to up their capability development and defence spending at a time when we have an economic crisis, and to address the key operational requirements of the alliance and other things? Perhaps it might be a question for Radek Sikorski, because I know the Polish government is facing very interesting budgetary discussions.
Okay, shall we start off, Congresswoman? Would you like to begin to address missile defense?
Well, I would think that a staffer from the House should know what the policy is on missile defense.
Everybody else might not.
The policy is clear. The Congress has spoken very eloquently last year. We have very robust systems in missile defense. Certainly, some of them are sold around the world. Certainly, Aegis, PAC-3, and THAAD, which is coming online, are some of the best systems, and they are for short and medium range. The long-range system, which has been deployed, has not reached operational effectiveness. It is a system that we have great hopes for, that we've invested billions of dollars in, but the Congress has made clear that until that system is tested sufficiently, probably 3 to 4 more tests, and the Secretary certifies that it is operationally effective, that it will not be deployed any further. That has nothing to do with our relationships with some of our best allies, including Poland and the Czech Republic. We also believe, frankly, that, as I said earlier in my comments, the current threat is to our allies, our forward deployed troops, and certainly the southern tier of Europe from the existing exorbitant threat in Iran of short and medium range missiles, and we have zero capability right now to defend against that. That is a threat, by the way, unlike the long-range threat, that is very portable. So it is something that is almost as existential when it comes to our friends and allies and our territories that we want to protect. What I think the Congress wants to see, and I will not speak for the Obama administration, but what the Congress wants to see is much more of a congruent understanding of these threats and a movement toward a networked system. Now, we have worked diligently to prove to the Russians that our system is what it is. It's a defensive system. We've even had General Belyaevsky, when he was the head of the Russian military, to Colorado Springs, where he was pushing the buttons to see exactly how the system worked. So what's really clear here is that we have three important things to do. We have to get a system that works on the long range. Most importantly, what we have to do is we have to get common agreement on what the threat is now. And the threat is short and medium range missiles targeted toward our forward deployed troops, our allies in southern Europe, Europe writ large, and we need to move in a NATO-ized way. Eventually, if we could develop a short and medium range system, one where we even shared optics with Russia, we could certainly bolt on the long range system once it has been tested and create a suite of systems that had complete coverage for everybody.
Radek, the budgetary question?
Well, I feel like I should comment on MD as well, because Ellen and I have been at it for months and years. And as you know, Poland has taken something of a political risk signing the agreement with the previous administration, even though there are objections from the Russian Federation. When we started discussing this business with the United States, the US assured us that they would persuade the Russians that it's purely defensive and that it would be a non-controversial decision. I'm afraid that Russian generals and even the Russian president still continues to threaten us with the deployment of medium-range missiles in our immediate vicinity. So we signed with the previous administration. We patiently wait for the decision of the new administration, and we hope we don't regret our trust in the United States.
I don't think you will.
On the budgetary question that was posed?
We're all affected by the financial crisis. Poland actually less than some other countries. We're still expected to grow this year, and we haven't had a single bank failure. But this is a time to re-examine one's priorities. So we are doing that, and because we agree that Afghanistan is the priority, we will be withdrawing our contingents from the Golan Heights, where we've been for 35 years with the UN, from the Lebanon, and from Chad by the end of the year, so as to be able to reinforce Afghanistan, because that is the priority. So we are withdrawing from the easier peacekeeping missions in order to reinforce our mission in Ghazni, which is on the Kabul-Kandahar road and is by no means easy. But if I could pick up on the Danish point about Russian Is there a future for Russia in NATO? Because I think Ambassador Chizhov yesterday said that in the 90s we talked about it and we no longer do. And look, Poland is the last country in Europe that wants to be on some kind of a new front line. We don't. It's not comfortable to be on the front line. So we've worked hard to improve our relations with Russia, and I regret the fact that we no longer even intellectually think about Russia's possible closer relationship. But let's remember why. When NATO came to our border, when Germany reunified in the early 1990s, we didn't see that as a threat. Why? Because we defined the relationship as possibly a relationship of alliance. Now, Russia defined at some point NATO as not a friendly organization, but it was her decision. So the question about Russia's membership is a question about what Russia would do. Would Russia be willing to become a democracy? We used to have non-democracies in NATO, but I think that those days are past. We now have standards. So you need to have a democratic system of government, you need to have firm civilian control over your armed forces, and you need to have resolved your border disputes with your neighbors. And then you need to apply and to be a candidate. So would Russia be willing to do those things that could eventually lead to membership? And I think if she were, she would have plenty of adherents inside NATO.
Time is marching on. I'm going to stop it there. I think, though, we should be clear that great changes can take place. I remember greeting former Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, well, he was then Secretary of Defense, at another regular conference venue in Germany, in southern Germany. I don't know if we're allowed to mention the name. It was an era of great divisions in the alliance, and I shouted out to him, "Secretary, what's it like arriving in the heart of old Europe?" And he looked at me and he smiled and he said, he said, "When you get to my age, old is a term of endearment." So there you are. It's, all that remains is, I think, to thank you, particularly, of course, to thank our panel. I think since this is one of the last public events before the summit, I think it's worth pointing out that the role and job that the current Secretary General has done. We've a lot in the papers about succession and potential candidates and so on. As a journalist, you meet obviously you meet the Secretary General, you meet lots of his staff, and it's interesting. You always say to people, what's he really like? And there are lots of public figures who you ask that question, and I got to tell you, you don't get terribly pleasant answers. And at NATO the other day, I went round and spoke to a few people. I said, this, and 2 or 3 people all said the same thing. They all said that the Secretary General is leaving his post at the height of his powers, and I think that is actually a remarkable testament to what he has achieved during a very critical and difficult period. So if you could thank all of our panel.
Jonathan, thank you. I also want to give our special thanks